Good evening. Now, this evening we're going to do a little traveling back in time, thanks to Arnold Bennett. And by that I mean Bennett was born in 1867 and died in 19. Traveling back in time, we're going to go to a time when lighting one's way to bed meant carrying a candle, not turning on the electricity. So, what Thomas Hardy did for his Wessex country, Arnold Bennett did for the Five Towns, situated in the Pottery District of North Staffordshire. Staffordshire is Bennett's literary treasure house. Now, this typical story, which I'm about to read you, laid in the Pottery District, gives him a chance to a group of middle-class people against the backdrop of industrial England. And the story is called The Silent Brothers. John and Robert Hessian, brothers, bachelors, and dressed in mourning, sat together after supper in the parlor of their house at the bottom of Oldcastle Street, Bursley. Maggie, the middle-aged servant, was clearing the table. "Leave the cloth and the coffee," said John the elder. "Mr. Liversage is coming in." "Yes, Mr. John," said Maggie. "Slate, Maggie," Robert ordered laconically. With a gesture toward the mantelpiece, said Maggie. She gave him a slate with slate pencil attached, which hung on a nail near the mantelpiece. Robert took the slate and wrote on it, "What is Liversage coming about?" And he pushed the slate across the table to John. Whereupon John wrote upon the slate, "Don't know. He telephoned me he wanted to see us tonight." And he pushed back the slate to Robert. This singular procedure was not in the least attributable to deafness on the part of the brothers. They were in the prime of life, aged 42 and 39 respectively, faculties. It was due simply to the fact that they had quarreled and would not speak to each other. The history of their quarrel would be incredible were it not full of that ridiculous, pathetic quality known as human nature. And did not similar things happen frequently in the manufacturing Midlands, where the general temperament is a fearful and strange compound of pride, obstinacy, unconquerableness, yes, stupidity. No single word had passed between the brothers in that house for 10 years. On the morning after the historic quarrel, Robert had not replied when John spoke to him. "Well," said John's secret heart, and John's secret heart ought to have known better, as it was older than its brother heart, "I'll teach him a lesson. I won't speak until he does." And Robert's secret heart had somehow divined this idiotic resolution, and had said, "We shall see." Maggie had been the first to notice. Then their friends noticed it, especially Mr. Liversage, the solicitor, their most intimate friend. But you are not to suppose that anybody protested very strongly, for John and Robert were not the kind of men with whom liberties may be taken. And moreover, Bursley was highly amused. At the beginning, it assumed the attitude of a disinterested spectator at a fight. It wondered who would win. Of course, it called both the brothers fools, yet in a tone somewhat sympathetic, because such a thing as had occurred to the Hessians might well occur to any man gifted with the true Bursley spirit. There's this to be said for a Bursley man: he will lie on it, and he will not complain. The Hessians suffered severely by their self-imposed dumbness, but they suffered like stoics. Maggie also suffered, and Maggie would not stand it. Maggie it was who invented the slate. Indeed, they had heard some plain truths from that stout, bustling woman. They had not yielded, but they had accepted the slate in order to minimize the inconvenience to Maggie. And afterward, As for friends, friends accustomed themselves to the status quo. There came a time when the spectacle of two men chattering to everybody else in a company and not saying a word to each other no longer appealed to Bursley's sense of humor. The silent scenes at which Maggie assisted every day did not either appeal to Maggie's sense of humor, because she had none. So the famous feud grew into a sort of elemental fact of nature. It was tolerated as the weather is tolerated. The brothers acquired regarded it as an interesting municipal curiosity. The sole imperfection in a lovely and otherwise perfect quarrel was that John and Robert, being both employed at Roycraft's Maholica manufactory, the one the works manager and the other as commercial traveler, were obliged to speak to each other occasionally in the way of business. Artistically, this was a pity, distantly. The partial truce necessitated by Roycrafts was confined strictly to Roycrafts. And when Robert was not on his journeys, these two strong, tall, dark, bearded men might often be seen of a night walking separately and doggedly down Oldcastle Street from the works within 5 yards of each other. And no one suggested the lunatic asylum. Such is the force of pride and of habit. The slate scratching was scarcely over that evening when Mr. Powell Liversedge appeared. He was a golden-haired man with a jolly face, lighter and shorter in structure than the two brothers. His friendship with them dated from school days, and it survived even the entrance of Liversedge into a learned profession. Liversedge, who, being a bachelor like the Hessians, had many unoccupied evenings, came to see the brothers regularly every Saturday night, and one or other of them dropped in upon him most Wednesdays. But this particular night was a Thursday. "How do?" John greeted him succinctly, between two puffs of a pipe. "How do?" replied Liversedge. "How do, Powell?" also between two puffs of a pipe. And "How do, little 'un?" replied Liversedge. A chair was indicated to him, and he sat down. And Robert poured out some coffee into a third cup, which Maggie had brought. John pushed away the extra special of the Staffordshire Signal, which he had been reading. "What's up these days?" John demanded. "Well," said Liversedge, and both brothers noticed that he was rather ill at ease. Instead of being humorous and lightly caustic as usual, the will's turned up. "The devil it has!" John exclaimed. "Well!" And then, as there was a pause, Liversedge added, "Yes, my sons, the will's turned up." "But where, you cuckoo, sitting there like that?" asked Robert. "Where?" "It was in that registered letter addressed to your sister that the post office people wouldn't hand over until we'd taken out letters of administration." "Well, I'm ashamed," muttered John. "Who'd have thought of that?" "You've got the will, then?" Liversedge nodded. The Hessians had an elder sister, Mrs. Bott, the widow of a colour merchant, and Mrs. Bott had died suddenly 3 months ago, the night after a journey to Manchester. Even at the funeral, the brothers met each other. Mrs. Bott had wealth, wit, and wisdom, together with certain peculiarities, of which one was an excessive secrecy. It was known that she had made a will, because she had more than once notified the fact in a tone suggestive of highly important issues, but the will had refused to be found. So Mr. Liversedge had been instructed to take out letters of administration of the estate, which divided equally between the brothers. and 12 or 13,000 pounds may be compared to a financial beefsteak that cuts up very handsomely for 2 persons. The carving knife was about to descend on its succulence when, lo, the will. "How came the will to be in the post?" asked Robert. "The handwriting on the envelope was your sister's," said Liversedge, "and the package was posted in Manchester. Very probably she had taken the will to Manchester to show it to a lawyer or something of that sort, and then she was afraid of losing it on the journey back, and so she sent it to herself by register, of course. She was dead." "That wasn't a bad scheme of poor Marianne's," John commented. "It was just like her," said Robert, speaking pointedly to Liversedge. "But what an odd thing." Now, both these men were, no doubt excusably, agonized by curiosity to learn the contents of the will. But would either of them be the first to express that curiosity? Not for the fortune itself. To do so would scarcely have been Bursley-ish. It would certainly not have been Hessian-like. So Liversedge was obliged to say, "I reckon I'd better read you the will, eh?" The brothers nodded. "Mind you," said Liversedge, "it's not my will. I've had nothing to do with it, so kindly keep your hair on. As a matter of fact, she must have drawn it up herself. It's not drawn properly at all, but it's witnessed all right, and it'll hold water, just as well as if the blooming Lord Chancellor had fired it up for her in person." He produced the document and read awkwardly, "And my will. You are both of you extremely foolish, John and Robert, and I've often told you so. Nobody has ever understood, and nobody ever will understand, why you quarrel like that over Annie Emery. You are punishing yourselves, but you are punishing her as well. And it isn't fair her waiting all these years. So I give all my estate, no matter what it is, to whichever of you marries Annie, and I hope this will teach you a lesson. You need it more than you need my money. But you must be married within a year of my death. And if the one that marries cares to give 5,000 pounds or so to the other, of course there's nothing to prevent him. This is just a hint. And if you don't either of you marry Annie within a year after Miss Annie Emery, spinster, stationer, and fancy goods dealer, Duckbank, Bursley. She deserves something for her disappointment, and she shall have it. Mr. Liversedge, solicitor, must kindly be my executor, and I commit my soul to God, hoping for a blessed resurrection, 20th January, 1896. Signed, Marianne Bott, widow. As I told you, the witnessing is in order." Liversedge finished. "Give it here," said John shortly, and scanned the piece of paper. And Robert actually bore up his shoulder, ample proof that he was terrifically moved. "And do you mean to tell me that a will like that is good in law?" exclaimed John. "Of course it's good in law," Liversedge replied. "Legal phraseology is a useful thing, and it often saves trouble in the end, but it ain't indispensable, you know." "Humph," was Robert's comment as he resumed his seat and relighted his pipe. All 3 men were nervous, each to meet the eyes of the other 2. An unmajestic silence followed. "Well, I'll be off, I think," Liversedge remarked at length, with difficulty. He rose. "I say," Robert stopped him, "better not say anything about this to Annie, eh?" "I will say nothing," agreed Liversedge. infamously and unprofessionally concealing the fact that he had already said something. And he departed. The brothers sat in fluttered meditation over the past and the future. 10 years woman of 23, bravely starting in business for herself amid the plaudits of the admiring town. And John had fallen in love with her courage and her sense and her feminine charm. But alas, as Ovid points out, how difficult it is for a woman to please only one man. Robert also had fallen in love with Annie. Each brother had accused the other of underhand and unbrotherly practices in the pursuit of Annie. Each was profoundly hurt by the accusations, and each, in the immense, privately sworn to prove his innocence by having nothing more to do with Annie. Such is life. Such is man. Such is the terrible egoism of man. And such it was that, for the sake of wounded pride, John and Robert not only did not speak to one another for 10 years, but they spoiled at least one of their lives. And they behaved ignobly to Annie, who would certainly have married either one or the other of them. John pulled a coin out of his pocket and made the gesture of tossing. "Who shall go first?" he explained. Robert had a queer sensation in his spine as his elder brother spoke to him for the first time in 10 years. He wanted to reply vocally. He had a most imperious desire to reply vocally, but he could not. Something stronger even than the desire prevented his tongue from moving. John tossed the coin, it was a sovereign, and covered it with his hands. Murmured, somewhat hoarsely, but it was his. And they went to bed. The side door of Miss Emery's shop was in Brick Passage, and not in the main street, so that a man, even a man of commanding stature and formidable appearance, might, by insinuating himself into Brick Street off King Street, and then taking the passage from the quieter end, arrive at it without attracting too much attention. From the moment when he quitted his own house that Friday evening in June, he had been subject to the delusion that the collective eye of Burnsley was upon him. As a matter of fact, the collective eye of Burnsley is much too large and important to occupy itself exclusively with a single individual. Burnsley is not a village, and let no one think it. Nevertheless, John was subject to that delusion. The shop was shut, as he knew it would be, but the curtained window of the parlor, between the side door and the small shuttered side window of the shop, gave a strange suggestion of interesting verticity within. John cast a fearful eye on the main thoroughfare. Nobody seemed to be passing. The chapel keeper of the Wesleyan Chapel on the opposite side of Trafalgar Road was refreshing the massive Corinthian portico of that fane, and paying no attention whatsoever to the Temple of Eros, which Miss Emery's shop had suddenly become. So John knocked. I am a fool, he thought, as he knocked. Because he did not quite know what he was about. He had to approach Annie Emery before his brother. But what then? Well, he did desire to marry her, quite as much for herself as for his sister's fortune. But what then? How was he going to explain the tepidity, the desertion, the long sin against love of 10 years? In short, how was he going to explain the inexplicable? He could decidedly do nothing that evening except make a blundering ass of himself. And how soon would Robert have the right to come along and have his say? That point had not been settled. Points so extremely delicate cannot be settled on a slate, and he had not dared to broach it viva voce to his younger brother. He had been too afraid of a rebuff. He then hoped that Annie's servant would tell him that Annie was out. Annie, however, took him at a disadvantage by opening the door herself. "Well, Mr. Hessian," she exclaimed, her face bursting into a swift and welcoming smile. "I was just passing," the donkey in him blundered forth, "and I thought—" However, in 15 seconds, he was on the domestic side of the sitting room window, between the fireplace and the piano, and Annie had taken his hat and told him that her servant was out for the evening. "But I'm disturbing your supper, Miss Emery," he said. Flurried though he was, he could not fail to notice the white embroidered cloth spread diagonally on the table, and the cold meat and the pastry and the glittering cutlery and crystal thereon. "Not at all," she replied. "Yet, I expect." "No," he said, not thinking. "It would be nice of you to help me eat mine," said she. "Oh, but really—" But she got plates and things out of the cupboard below the bookcase, and there he was. She would take no refusal. It was wondrous. "I'm awfully glad I came now," his thought ran. "I'm managing it rather well. And poor Bob." His sole discomfort was that he could not invent a sufficiently ingenious explanation of his call. You can't tell a woman you've called to make love to her, and when your previous call happens to have been 10 years ago, seem to be demanded. Ultimately, as Annie was so very pleased to see him, so friendly, so feminine, so equal to the occasion, he decided to let his presence in her abode that night stand as one of those central facts in existence that need no explanation. And they went on talking and eating till the dusk deepened, and Annie lit the gas and drew the blind. He watched her on the sly as she moved about the room. He decided that she did not appear a day older. Figure, the same neatness, the same fair skin and fair hair, the same little nose, the same twinkle in the eye. Only perhaps the twinkle in the eye was a trifle less cruel than it used to be. She was not a day older. In this he was, of course, utterly mistaken. She was 10 years older. She was 33, with 10 years of successful commercial enterprise behind her. She would never be 23 again. Still, she was a most desirable woman, and a woman infinitely beyond his deserts. Her air of general capability impressed him, and with that there was a marvelous hint of a concealed wish to surrender. Well, she made him feel big and masculine. In brief, a man. He regretted the lost 10 years. His present way of life seemed intolerable to him. The new heaven opened its gate and gave glimpses of paradise. After all, he felt himself well qualified for that paradise. He felt without knowing it. By Jove, his thought ran, at this rate, I might propose to her in a week or two. And again, poor old Bobby. A quarter of an hour later, in some miraculous manner, they were more intimate than they had ever been, much more intimate. He revised his estimate of the time that must elapse before he might propose to her. In another 5 minutes, he was fighting hard against a mad impulse to propose to her on the spot. And then the fight was over, and he had lost. He proposed to her under the rose-colored shade of the Wilsbach light. She drew away, and with the rapidity of lightning, in the silence which followed, he went back to his original criticism of himself. that he was a fool. Naturally, she would request him to leave. She would accuse him of effrontery. Her lips trembled. He prepared to rise. "It's so sudden," she said. Bliss, glory, celestial joy. Her words were at least equivalent to an absolution of his effrontery. She would accept. She would accept. But she jumped up too and retreated. He was not to win his prize so easily. "Please sit down," she murmured. "I must think it over," she said, apparently mastering herself. "Shall you be at chapel next Sunday morning?" "Yes," he answered. "If I am there, and if I am wearing white roses in my hat, it will mean—" She dropped her eyes. "Yes?" he queried, and she nodded. "Supposing you aren't there, then the Sunday after," she said. He thanked her in his Hessian style. "I prefer that way of telling you," she smiled demurely. "It will avoid the necessity for another stand." Quite so," he agreed. "I quite understand." "And if I do see those roses," he went on, "I shall take it upon myself to drop in for tea, may I?" She paused. "In any case, you mustn't speak to me coming out of chapel. Please." As he walked home down Oldcastle Street, he said to himself that the age of miracles was not past. Also that, after all, he was not so old as the toll of his years would mathematically indicate. Her absence from chapel on the next Sunday disagreed with him. However, Robert was away nearly all the week, and he had the house to himself to dream in. It frequently happened to him to caught no glimpse of her, and though he really was in serious need of writing paper and envelopes, he dared not enter. Robert returned on the Friday. On the morning of the second Sunday, John got up early in order to cope with the new necktie that he had purchased in Hanbridge. Nevertheless, he found Robert afoot before him, and Robert, by some unlucky chance, was wearing not merely a new necktie, but a new suit of clothes. They breakfasted in their usual august silence, and John gathered from remark of Robert's to Maggie when she had brought in the boots that Robert meant to go to chapel. Robert, being a commercial traveler, and therefore a bit of a caution, did not attend chapel with any remarkable assiduity, and John, in the privacy of his own mind, blamed him for having been so clumsy as to choose that particular morning for breakfast, for breaking the habits of a lifetime. Still, the presence of Robert in the pew could not prejudicially affect John, and so there was no genuine cause for gloominess. After a time, it became apparent that each was waiting for the other to go. John began to get annoyed. At last he made the plunge and went up Oldcastle Street, opposite the mansion which is still called Miss Peel's. He perceived Robert 50 yards behind. It was a glorious June day. He blushed as he entered the chapel. If he was nervous, it may be accorded to him as excuse that the happiness of his life depended on what he could see within the next few minutes. However, he felt pretty sure that it was exciting all the same. He was obliged to pass Miss Emery's, and it was empty. Robert arrived. The organist finished the voluntary. The leading tenor of the choir put up the number of the first hymn. The minister ascended the staircase of the great mahogany pulpit and prayed silently and arranged his papers in the leaves of the hymn book and glanced about to see who was there and who was presumably still in bed, and coughed. And then Miss Annie Emery sailed in with that air of false calm which is worn by the experienced traveler who catches a train by the fifth of a second. The service commenced. She was wearing white roses. There could be no mistake as to that. There were about 155 white roses in the garden of her hat. What a thrill ran through John's heart. He had won Annie, and he had won the fortune. Yes, he would give Robert the odd £5,000. His state of mind might even lead him to make it guineas. He heard not a word of the sermon, and throughout the service he rose up and sat down several instants after the rest of the congregation, because he was so absent-minded. After service, he ordered not to break his promise to the divine Annie. So did Robert. This ill-timed rudeness on Robert's part somewhat retarded the growth of a young desire in John's heart to make friends with poor Bob. Then he got up and left, and Robert followed. They dined in silence. John decided after he had seen Annie and could tell Robert that he was formally engaged. The brothers ate little. They both improved their minds during their repast, John with the Christian Commonwealth, and Robert with the Saturday cricket edition of the Signal. I regret it. Then, after pipes, they both went out for a walk, naturally not in the same direction. The magnificence of the weather filled them both with the joy of life. As for John, he went out for a walk simply because he could not contain himself within the house. He could not wait immovable till 4:30, the hour at which he meant to call on Annie for tea and the betrothal kiss. They wandered as far as Oldcastle, all in a silk hat and a frock coat. It was precisely 4:30 as he turned unassumingly from Brick Street into Brick Passage, and so approached the side door of Annie Emery's. And his astonishment and anger were immense when he saw Robert, likewise in silk hat and frock coat, penetrating into Brick Passage from the other end. They met, lighted. "What's the meaning of this?" John demanded furiously. And simultaneously Robert demanded, "What in Hades are you doing here?" Only Sunday and the fine clothes and the proximity to Annie prevented actual warfare. "I'm calling on Annie," said John. "So am I," said Robert. "Well, you're too late," said John. "Oh, I'm late, am I?" said Robert with a disdain. "I tell you, you're too late," said John. "You may as well know at once that I proposed to Annie and she's accepted me." I like that, said Robert. "Don't shout," said John. "I'm not shouting," said Robert, "but you may as well know that you're mistaken, my boy. It's me that's proposed to Annie and been accepted." "When did you propose to her?" said John. "On Friday, if you must know," said Robert. "And she accepted you at once?" said John. "No, she said that if she was wearing white roses in her hat this morning at chapel, that would mean she accepted her," said John. "I suppose you'll admit she was wearing white roses in her hat," said Robert, controlling himself. "Liar," said John, and continued breathless. "That's what she said to me. She must have told you that white roses meant a refusal." "Oh, no, she didn't," said Robert, wailing secretly, but keeping up a formidable show of courage. "You're an old fool," he added vindictively. They were both breathing hard. "Come away," said John. "Come away. We can't talk here. She may look out of the window." So they went away. They walked very quickly home, and once in the parlor, they began to have it out. And before they had done, the reading of cricket news on Sunday was as nothing compared to the desecrating iniquity which they committed. The scene was not such as can be decently recounted. But about 6 o'clock, Maggie entered, and at considerable personal risk, brought them back to a sense of what was due to their name, the town, and the day. She then stated that she would not remain in such a house, and she departed. "But whatever made you do it, dearest?" These words were addressed on the glorious summer evening which closed that glorious summer day, and they were addressed to her by no other person than Powell Liversage. The pair were in the garden of the house in Trafalgar Road occupied by Mr. Liversage and his mother, and they looked westward over the distant ridge of Hillport, where the moon was setting. "Whatever made me do it," repeated Annie, and the twinkle in her eye had that charming cruelty which John had missed. "Did they not deserve it? Of course I can talk to you now with perfect freedom, can't I? Well, what do you think of it? Here for 10 years, neither one nor the other does more than rent, and all of a sudden they come down on me like that, simply because there's a question of money. I couldn't have believed men could be so stupid. No, I really couldn't. They're friends of yours, Powell, I know, but remember, that's no matter. But it was too ridiculously easy to lead them on. They'd swallow any flattery. I just did it to see what they'd do, and I think I arranged it pretty well. I quite expected they would call about the same time, and then shouldn't I have given them my mind? Unfortunately, they met outside and got very hot. I saw them from the bedroom window and went away." "You mustn't forget, my dear girl," said Liversage, "that it was you they quarreled about. I don't want to defend the money that sent them to you. It was more that the money gave them an excuse for coming." "It was a very bad excuse then," said Annie. "Agreed," Liversage murmured. The moon was extremely lovely and romantic against the distant spire of Hillport Church, and its effect on the couple was just what might have been anticipated. "Perhaps I'm sorry," Annie admitted at length with a charming grimace. "Oh, I don't think there's anything to be sorry, but of course they'll think I've had a hand in it. You see, I've never breathed a word to them about my feelings toward you. No? No, it would have been rather a delicate subject, you see, with them. And I'm sure they'll be staggered when they know that we got engaged last night. They'll certainly say I've been after you for..." "No, they won't. They're decent chaps, really, very decent." "Anyway, you may be sure, dear," said Annie stiffly, "that I shan't rob them of their vile money. Nothing would induce me to touch it." "Of course not, dearest," said Liversage. Or rather, the finer part of him said it. The baser part somewhat regretted that vile 12,000 or so. "I must be truthful again." At the same moment, old Mrs. Liversage came hastening down the garden, and Liversage dropped the hand. "Powell," she said, "here's John Hessian, and he wants to see you." "The dickens!" exclaimed Liversage, glancing at Annie. "I must go," said Annie. "I shall go by the fields. Good night, dear Mrs. Liversage." "Wait 10 seconds," Liversage pleaded, "and I'll be with you." And he ran off. John had a good drawing room. "Powell," said he, "I've had a fearful row with Bob, and I can't possibly sleep in our house tonight. Don't talk to me, but let me have one of the beds in your spare room, will you? There's a good chap." "Why, of course, Johnny," said Liversage. "Of course." "And I'll go right to bed now," said John. An hour later, after Powell Liversage had seen his affiance to her abode and returned home, and after his mother had gone to bed. There was a knock at the front door, and Liversage opened it to Robert Hessian. "Look here, Powell," said Robert, whose condition was deplorable. "I want to sleep here tonight. Do you mind? The fact is, I've had a devil of a shindy with Jack, and Maggie's run off, and anyhow I couldn't possibly stop in the same house with Jack tonight." "But what—" "See here," said Robert, "I can't talk. Just let me have a bed in your spare room. I'm sure your mother won't mind." "Why, certainly," said Liversage. He lit a candle, escorted Robert upstairs, opened the door of the spare room, gave the candle to Robert, pushed him in, said "Good night," and shut the door. What a night! And that is The Silent Brothers by Arnold Bennett. There are gems out there, just gems waiting to be found and read. And I hope you've enjoyed this one. Oh, my dears, that's it for tonight for Tales and Cocktails. And I apologize for the vocal glips from time to time. I'm not quite up to par today, but nonetheless, I shall be up to par next week, and I will look forward to seeing you and reading to you then. So, good night, my dears. Thank you for being with me. See you next week.